I'll be covering basically how to build LLM applications, how to integrate LLM into your existing applications, and kind of moreover trying to cover what are the best mental models when it comes to building on top of LLMs, kind of across different stages of maturity of the organization. And so a little bit about me. I used to live in Berlin for a long time. Now I live in New York. Started my career as a researcher on adversarial networks. So I was creating deepfake videos, if you remember. That was like back in 2016, 17, 18. Started my first company also in the ML tooling space. We're building a developer tool for computer vision teams. Second company in Berlin in kind of future work task automation, also heavily built on top of machine learning. And then now finally building Commonbase. And Commonbase has gone through a few different iterations. So initially, we started and raised for kind of the first iteration of the product, which was building privacy-first enabled LLMs. That was very much focused on the European market as well. And so that was a product where I just wanted to help organizations get started with AI as quickly as possible, and just saw kind of compliance and privacy as being like two of the biggest bottlenecks. And so that's also where most of the content for the talk comes from. I talked to lots of companies, lots of CTOs from across different organizations, and heard about their problems of what they got stuck with, while getting started, while trying to put the first thing into production. So that's also what I'm kind of trying to focus a little bit more on. The second version of the product that we experimented with was automating technical integrations. So basically, how can you fully automate, for example, a Salesforce integration into your organizations? And rather recently, pivoted to something completely different, which is now being in real-time translation space. So we're helping businesses speak any language to their customers. So we're basically a real-time speech-to-speech translation engine. And so kind of very researchy, but still. So if anybody wants to speak Chinese, you can reach out to me later. I can give you a personal demo of how you would sound in your voice in whatever language you want. So that's a little bit of kind of background on myself. And now kind of moving on to actually getting you a little bit involved. I'm kind of curious where everyone is like in their organizations in terms of like LLM adoption. Are you in like the pilot stage? Are you in building? Do you have first applications or features in production? Or maybe like what is the thing that you're most excited to build on top of LLMs? And you can just like leave them in the comments. I will just use it as a way to engage. So yeah, maybe just take a minute to think about like what is the most exciting thing that you would like to build in your organization using an LLM or using any type of machine learning, really. Can be a feature, can be a new product. No, this is basically, you can just leave your idea in the comment section, just like exactly. So what is the LLM feature or product that you're most excited to build inside your organization? I think if we do it with text, it's just slightly easier than going in rounds.
Just put it in the chat.
Yeah, just put it in the chat. Interesting. I like the different directions. I'm very happy to also cover them later and kind of like jump into any specifics of like what are the blockers that you might have run into, just to discuss them in a wider setting. Okay, I'll let them keep coming in. I just wanted to get a kind of a quick pulse check. Also, the way how I kind of structured the presentation is I wanted to talk a little bit about what are the success modes of getting first started with LLM applications. What is the success and failure modes of going into production? And then finally, what is the success and failure modes of kind of using LLMs at scale in larger organizations? And so kind of moving on, I assume that, when you read the initial description, a lot of you might have expected me to kind of take one of those large maps and do like a few circles and say like, those are the 3 tools that you should use. The problem with that approach is that the entire landscape is moving so fast that it's really, really hard to keep up with basically what is the latest and greatest. And so, a tool that you might all know is kind of LangChain. And so, and then LangChain came, everybody tried to use it. It was not as amazing as, people kind of expected. And so that's also why I actually don't really want to focus so much on very specific tools. I would much rather want to focus on the mental models that you can use or that you can give your organizations in order to make better decisions when, going around building and creating architectures for your new features. And so getting also like a little bit into the whole LLM landscape, I would say the exact same thing, just as the tools are very fast evolving. The reason for that is that the LLMs are very fast evolving. And so, here's one of the graphs that you can see probably every month, there's a new LLM provider that says that, hey, our model is the latest and greatest. And so I think the point is like, do not fall in love with a tool, do not fall in love with an LLM, and kind of just try to think about it from a little bit of more a higher perspective. And so also when it comes to AI versus traditional software, I think the biggest difference is AI is not predictable. When you make an API call to a Postgre database, there's only so many responses that you can get back. When you call, an OpenAI's API, the responses can vary greatly. And so that you also need to have that mindset when you're building applications, because that there's always going to be edge cases that you need to cover, be that using humans as a loop, or be that kind of being okay with some level of error. The second thing is cost. APIs are much more expensive than calling your Postgre server, and so again, just a slightly different mindset where the unit economics might actually be different than building traditional software. Speed of innovation, already talked about it. Things are changing so fast that I feel like everyone should also have a very flexible mindset. There are no tools that are 10 years old, and so that's also why we're still seeing kind of what really stands out of the rest in the next few years. And finally, talent. I wanted to touch talent because I think that's also what a lot of people are talking about: how to build teams in a way that they are self-organized and independent to carry out the projects in a way where they don't need too much supervision. And so, jumping into it, every AI project, when you're starting to kind of build stuff in the very super early phase, it will be messy, and it should be messy. And so what I mean by kind of always starting every LLM project in the playground, I really actually mean in one of those kind of chat windows where you can use different graphical interfaces and test out whether the project that you want to build is actually viable. You can test, different LLMs against each other. You can test using dummy data. You can take a few production use cases. I think my point is every project, be the non-technical people or technical people, it should start in the playground. First, make sure that what you're building actually makes sense before you even get to the coding phase. And I feel like you can save your entire organization a lot of time if you first need to prove the viability in the playground. And so kind of digging a little bit deeper into the pilot, so kind of like after you are out of the playground mode, I think the most important kind of things to think about at the pilot stage where you're just getting going with your organization is don't think about the stack. Just let people pick whatever the tools that they're most excited about. Optimize for number of experimentation and the velocity of experimentation. And finally, kind of already mentioned, just don't really think about, do not suggest very specific stack choices, do not specific, languages. If people want to use, JavaScript, let them use JavaScript. If people want to use Python, let them use Python. And also one success mode that I actually wanted to point out here, if you're just getting started in a large organization to kind of like create more awareness around LLMs, hackathons are a great way how to get an entire organization on board. And so maybe here a little story. Maybe some of you know of a product marketing tool called Post-Hot. It's basically a Segment competitor. And they did an internal hackathon with the entire organization, not only engineers, to build projects that people will be most excited about. And so, they ideated using like product people, marketing people, sales people, engineers built hackathons over like Thursday and Friday in the organization. And as a result, they had 4 projects come out of that hackathon that actually made it all the way to production. And so, but that's just a way how to get people very excited about the possibilities, how to let different organizations think about, hey, what could we automate here? What could we make 10 times better in our organization when we finally have, access to AI and kind of whichever capability. Failure modes for just getting things off the ground. AI should not be CTO's passion project. I've talked to CTOs of large German scale-ups, and we're talking like 1,000 plus. And I feel like they played with kind of LLMs on the weekends, trying to find the most perfect use case for the organization. And that definitely does not lead to the best outcomes. And so that's kind of the opposite of the hackathon approach. And Joe, just kind of pointing it out there that that's probably not the way to go, even though it sounds very exciting. Second failure mode, AI should not be the responsibility of data teams. Again, I've seen in very large organizations where it's typically the head of data science or some senior data scientists that get in charge of introducing AI to their organization. Again, data people do not have awareness of the actual product problems, the actual user problems. And so they tend to build stuff that sounds interesting, but is actually not that valuable. So again, no single point of failure in terms of team. And final point, every team, every person, technical or non-technical, should have access to a playground or a developer API key. If somebody wants to build something to quickly prototype, they should have a way how to get their hands on a developer account just to play around. And so that should be there. That should be, everybody should know where to get those things from just to get things off the ground. This kind of wraps up the whole pilot space. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them either in the comment section or the Q&A, and I will kind of try to just go through them as we get along. Okay, finally, when we have those pilot projects running internally and we kind of like some of them, then comes kind of the production stage. Hey, we want to ship that thing to real users, and kind of like what comes up there. And so how to set yourself up for success before you go into production. And also what changes here is that as customer data starts being used, you all of a sudden have legal risk. All of a sudden you have potentially cost risk, when in fact, good problem to have, but if your feature gets used a lot, you might rack up costs quite fast as well. And finally, the first few pilot projects are going to set the stone for the rest of the company. If the first few pilot projects go really bad, it will likely be much harder to kind of introduce LLMs in the rest of the organization. And so the success mode of going from successful pilots into production is pick one platform for the first production projects to speed things up. And so what I mean by that, for example, when I was helping organizations kind of get their first things into production, I almost always show them how to get started on top of Azure, because their legal teams were typically most comfortable with using just another Azure service. And so, you get the OpenAI's API, but all of a sudden, if you go to legal, they're much more kind of happier to, just approve another API instead of bringing a whole new software provider into the mix. Second thing, if you're picking which project should first go into production, look at what worked for the pilots. Which pilots produce the most value, which software stacks were most reasonable for the pilots, and just pick the things that the teams like the most. And so have some consolidation when going into production, especially because if you keep the stack the same, you can share the learnings with the rest of the company a lot easier. Whereas that would be a lot harder if everybody uses different tools for the few very first projects that will likely be the measuring stick for the rest of the organizations for whatever comes afterwards. A few failure cases for going into production, which is a little bit the opposite of what I just said, definitely do get legal buy-in before you push something into production. I have seen it backfire a lot, and especially in fintech, where teams put small things into production, and then all of a sudden there's either the CEO comes in or the CIO that says like, hey, there's no way that we can do this. We're using things that are not on our privacy policy, yada yada yada. So definitely get the org on board before you go into production. Second thing, as I said, ideally do some consolidation just to make the go prod a little bit smoother. And so, as your makes sense, try to keep as many of your existing tools to just like simplify and get that real feedback in as quickly as possible. So no point to spend, weeks or months over legal talking about, hey, do we need this new tool or not? And maybe final thing that I find quite important as well, very often CTOs come to me and ask like, hey, who should I hire before going into production with this like new large experiment? And they often ask me like, hey, do you know somebody with like 3 years of LLM experience? And I'm typically like, I need to admit that I don't know anyone with 3 years of LLM experience because, people have really used them for 1 year, right? And so you do not need specific talent for that. And so try to get everyone on the existing teams on board with what it just means to use LLMs, and also like how to maintain them when you go into production. So talent should never be a picking, like a stopping point when thinking about kind of that pivotal step. Once you are in production with a few different projects, and you kind of see that, hey, this actually makes sense, we're very happy with the results, or if you're in production with internal tools and you feel like they make a lot of sense, like for example the Q&A tool that I talked about, then that's kind of the moment when comes the step of like, hey, we proved that we like the technology. We will likely have the C-levels buy-in to basically start rolling it out across the org. Then comes really the question of like, hey, how can we use LLMs at a much larger scale across all organizations, not only the engineering organizations? And so when you go into the scaling mode, the thing that changes is all of a sudden you're going to have a very large platitude of APIs being used. Very likely a lot of new tools being introduced into the mix because the needs of different product teams are different. You also have the question of how do we get every org on board? How do we get HR on board? How do we get legal on board to use LLMs? How do we get the salespeople on board to, start building an automated outreach, bot? All of those things, right? Like how can you basically change that mindset across the entire organization? That becomes an issue. And finally, once you start using LLMs everywhere, costs do add up rather quickly. And so that's also something to think about once you start going into the scaling mode. And so what success looks like at that stage of the company is ideally you put in place observability and product analytics tools. One, to measure the impact that the LLMs have on end users or also internal teams, and just collecting information about how things in production use. And the success case here is actually to use your existing tool stack. And so, for example, I also have this example here. If you're doing observability for LLMs, treat them like any other API. If you're using Datadog for all of your other APIs, use Datadog for LLMs as well. You can use it for cost measurement. You can use it for latency measurement. And the reason why I heavily propose using existing tools is because every other team in the organization will have access to the data from the experiments. When instead, you will introduce Langsmith or any other latest YC batch tool, all of a sudden these will become those data silos that people will not have access to, and so all of a sudden you're just slowing down the speed of experimentation there. Second point that I wanted to make here: every product team that is responsible for like their own specific product or like a feature in a larger product, they should have what is called an AI engineer. That is typically just it's a fancy way of saying a full stack engineer that knows how to do prompt engineering. And why I say that every team should have their own specific person or that, or multiple such people, is they will use their gut feeling to try to understand where can most value be created by introducing LLMs to our stack at any point of like kind of organizational maturity. And so again, the success case is that just like every feature team used to have a growth person join them, that was kind of like a Silicon Valley thing that got introduced 10 years ago. I think in the future, every successful feature team will have an AI engineer or a few of them that drive those LLM integrations. And finally, I like the quote that like, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. I feel like that's also very true in the LLM adoption phase. If you give someone the right incentive to actually introduce AI to optimize either use cases or internal workflows inside the organization, make their promotion dependent on, make that one part of their promotion cycle, just say that, hey, it's our organizational goal to introduce AI across all teams, and it is everyone's responsibility to take an initiative here. And if all of a sudden 20% of your promotion is reliant on you thinking about how to introduce AI at the organization to optimize workflows, people naturally gravitate towards, hey, just doing the thing that the C-level wants the organization to do. And so I strongly believe that kind of having the right incentive structure in place there actually makes the adoption a lot easier. I saw a question in the Q&A whether AI engineer is a future-proof job. So mixed feelings here. What I would say, I do not believe that a prompt engineer is a job in itself. I've seen many job postings for people that are supposed to do prompt engineering all day long. And to be very honest, the best prompt engineers, in my opinion, are the people that actually have the best knowledge of the underlying data and customers' problems. And so in different organizations, that might be that the best prompt engineer is the best specialist. And so a friend of mine is building a company here in New York for legal teams, and their prompt engineers are the legal people that they hired. And so they have like a bunch of lawyers working in their team that are doing the prompt engineering because they know what the right output is supposed to look like. In a lot of organizations that are, building tools for, let's say, like a classical SaaS tool for other startups, typically the best prompt engineer ends up being the product manager because they know what the end customer wants to see as the output of that LLM query. And so that's why I don't believe in the standalone prompt engineer role kind of as a thing that is supposed to stay in the organizations. And I truly believe that existing existing players or existing employees in the company will fit that role. And so I would always put the person with the best end user knowledge responsible for learning how to prompt engineer. And I actually took the slide out, but just to add on top of it, prompt engineering gives you 95% of the value. I am pretty anti fine tuning, and prompt engineering can actually help you go most of the way, especially now that the context windows have gotten so large. And so have those dedicated prompt engineers that I like to call AI engineers, because their daily job will likely still be writing React components, but 20% of their time might be doing fine crafting the best prompts for that specific use case. Yeah, and maybe I actually wanted to again introduce one success story here that I saw work out really well. A lot of you might know the company Deal. It's an international payroll provider. Their founders were, let's say, very early AI fans, and they wanted to basically bring AI across the entire organization. And so they did a lot of things right. One, they got the hackathons right. They got the kind of internal empowerment right of everyone being able to experiment with the tools. And so one of the biggest, and I would also say one of the most visible projects that they got live was building a tool for customer success, salespeople, and customer support people on top of all of their internal knowledge. And they're using a Notion in the background. And because they got the entire organization on board with this very first problem that they were facing, they also managed to ship a product with the very first try that was extremely useful. And so if you take part of any Deal onboarding call now or sales call, they will likely go into screen share and basically write a question that you would ask them, and show you the answer straight there on the call. And so initially, it's an internal management tool, and I'm very sure that soon after they will release it to the public once they have enough data that the level of hallucinations is okay. And so and that's also how you manage risk, right? You initially introduce something internally, and then you make it publicly available once you see that it works well enough. And so I think that's definitely one example where an entire organization got the AI adoption extremely right on an entire organizational level. The failure case when kind of starting to do things at scale is kind of the thing that I told you about, the tool selection. If you do pick one of those fancy tools that are made specifically for LLM ops, all of a sudden your data people will not have access to it. The data from the tool will not reach your data lake anymore, which means that your product teams will not have access to the data from it. And so you basically create a cascade of problems that come along with helping the entire organization use the data that comes out of the first experiments. And so that's the reason why I'm a big proponent of using existing observability tools, existing product analytics tools, like be it Segment, Amplitude, Mixpanel, whatever you're already using, because everyone already has access to them. The data pipelines are already in place, which means that very naturally you have a natural flow of knowledge in the organization. Second part, data team should be available to every product organization, every product team in the organization. And why I'm saying that, a lot of customer data is stuck in all over the organization and nobody knows where it is besides the data team. And even though data teams should not be responsible for AI adoption, they should absolutely be responsible for supporting every product team to get the AI features live. If you don't have that, that will be a major bottleneck to actually building highly useful features to basically improve your product for the end customers. And so the data team should be incentivized to support basically all the AI features that other teams are building. And maybe also a small anecdote, kind of what can go wrong if maybe organizations get slightly too excited about AI adoption. A friend of mine is building a code migration tool for large organizational teams. And so, for example, you can use this tool to go from like Python 2 to Python 3. And when he started selling that tool to, let's say, like very advanced organizations, especially in the US, I think the story actually comes from trying to sell to Datadog. It was really hard for him to sell anything to DevOps people because everybody wanted to work on the shiny LLM internal projects themselves. And all of a sudden, DevOps people were spending very little time doing DevOps work. And instead, they were just building fancy LLM projects internally. And so, again, you still want to make sure that everyone provides the value and meets the KPIs that their job requires. And so I think there are also exactly those cases where a lot of people that are just bored with their day-to-day job end up building the fanciest things possible. And so, I think that applies to like any software engineering role. But so that can definitely be a failure case in cases like a wild west where anyone can basically build what they want without kind of being too accountable for the outputs. So those are kind of a few of the things where I see things. One thing I would still add, I said that before you go into production, it's easier to go into production with a single LLM because the entire org knows what is being used. It's a lot easier to get legal on board. I would say when you start doing things at scale, do not get stuck on a single LLM. Do not get stuck on a single tool if you strongly feel like something else makes sense. And so it does make sense to try to use the best tool for the job. Just needs to be justified to actually go through the entire approval scheme. But if you're using it at scale across all product organizations, very likely will want to use more tools than from a single provider. So that kind of by and large covers this whole life cycle of going from pilot to production to kind of using AI at scale in a larger organization. And I think some of the few final thought pieces that I wanted to leave you with, just like how to think about AI adoption over the next few years in terms of like just mental models for you, but also your organizations. There's a few kind of assumptions that I am very confident in making, and the first one is about LLMs getting a lot smarter. The reason why AI is basically so hyped right now is because all of a sudden we have an API that you can throw any problem at, and it will give you a reasonable response. And we had machine learning for the last 10 years, maybe even 15 years. But the problem was every machine learning model had a very, very specific use case, which means that you had to invest a lot of time in order to start using machine learning for like a very specific task in the organization. But all of a sudden, we have this like one API to rule them all, and you can send it like any problem, and it will take care of it. And that basically brought down the barrier to adopting AI by like 10x, and that's the reason why everybody uses AI. I would say LLMs right now are probably at an IQ level of like 80 to 90. It's like they're a little bit less intelligent than an average human being. I'm very safe to make the assumption that as compute gets more advanced and as our models get much more advanced, LLMs will become much more intelligent than an average human being. And so that's a bet that you can safely make that, hey, you have a very complex use case in your organization and you feel like currently, GPT 4.0 is not good enough. In a year from now, it will likely be. And so that's something to kind of keep as a mindset in terms of like adoption and trying to, test out the same use cases that you have with new models that are coming out. A second assumption that I think is very easy to make, and that I think is very true if you look at the graphs, the average price per token has come down significantly. to a level where a lot of the tokens are free. In a way, I used to build my first iteration of the product was LLMs on the edge and on device. The latest Chrome version that is currently still in basically the alpha release phase has browser built-in LLMs available for free to the developers. And so you have a 3 billion model, 3 billion parameter model available to every Chrome user in the world. Obviously, that needs to get released on for all users. And those tokens are free. And so kind of just putting it out there that the costs are going to go dramatically down. And very likely in a year or two from now, we can build easy AI applications. And when I mean easy, I mean AI applications that do not need access to, GPT-17. You can build AI applications on models that are hosted on people's devices, and that is free for you. I am absolutely sure that Apple will ship also their phone with some foundational model on it, very potentially provided by OpenAI. Let's see. It will likely happen on Android. It's already happening on the browser, and so that is just the future that is coming at a rapid pace. And so all I'm saying, do not worry on cost. And I saw a question about the 3 billion model, like how does that affect basically RAM usage? Well, I think Chrome was never the most lightweight browser, and so I strongly assume that they will build in something very similar where you can basically make a call of like, hey, does the current Chromium actually support does the hardware that the Chrome is running on, does it support our 3 billion model? Does it support our 1 billion model? And maybe in the future, does it support our 10 billion model? And so you will be able to provide the experience in a way where for 90% of users, the on-device model gets used, and for 10% of the users, you will make a trip to the server. And so you asked, does it only consume 2 gigs of RAM? I think that's for a very highly optimized use case that probably Google tested, on maybe their Chromebooks or whatnot. So I think that's a little bit more promotional, but it kind of fits. If you have a quantized model of, for example, the 8 billion Mistral model, it does run on 10 gigs of RAM. So roughly that's that kind of holds true in the ballpark. And maybe, kind of getting back to the safe assumptions about the future, and we already talked about LLMs being everywhere. That I'm absolutely sure of. I think we already can see them everywhere. LLMs will never be 100% accurate, and that's the case with machine learning. Has been the way machine learning has been, will be the way how machine learning will be. So even if you have accuracy of 99%, you always need to think about what happens with that 1% where the output is not what you expected. If you have a very critical use case, humans will always stay in the loop. If you have a less critical use case, you might just be fine by putting a sticker on the application that, hey, do not trust the results, and everyone will still trust the results. But you need to have the mental model in place that, hey, they will never be fully reliable and predictable. And so that also goes to the mental model of like, hey, how are we going to build the applications if we know that we cannot 100% rely on them basically ever? And so yet they're super smart. And so that's an interesting paradigm that kind of you need to kind of be able to keep like both sides of the coin when designing applications. Yeah, I feel like I've had a 40-minute monologue. I feel like I'm just getting to the point where I feel like my throat's getting a little bit dry. So I hope that some of that content was useful. I'm very curious to answer any questions if you have about your very specific use cases, or dive deeper into any kind of other question that you might have about the whole presentation. So really, I would say I would give the stage to you. If you have any questions, leave them in the Q&A, leave them in the comments. I guess we can also raise hands. Chaya, you would need to say a little bit more about that. But so, okay, I will stop talking. I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have about the presentation, or can also be completely independent of the presentation.
Right, Oscar wants to raise his real hand. Awesome.
Everyone is so quiet. That's like, Heike, so thank you very much. It was really nice. It was really nice intro to everything around AI and the engineering part, and also it's like a very important part regarding is like how to define the teams, the roles, and everything around this. I also believe that's super important, interesting. And following on this, it's like I'm really curious. It's like, what is your preferred way or your point of view? It's like following the example. It's like, imagine you start a completely new AI-powered application. So how would you define your playground?
So is the question around how would I get started if I'm starting to build like a completely new product from scratch, no matter what the use case is? So I guess it slightly depends on who's the builder. I would say I'm a little bit addicted to LLMs, so I feel like I have a pretty good gut feeling for which tools to get started with. And so I have subscriptions to pretty much every LLM out there, and so I would typically test my initial use case with some derived user data or user data that has been generated by an LLM that actually works extremely well. And I would just try playing around with the very first use case. Let's say I'm building an email generation app. I would give it a few emails from my inbox, maybe 10 or so, and start experimenting with the prompt of like, hey, how can I get to a result that my users would like to see? And that's, again, I come back to, right? Like, I need to know what my end user deems as a good outcome, as a good output. And so I will play around the playground so long as I'm happy with basically production-like data going in and a response that my end user would like coming out. And that's when I would move over to actually starting to integrate it into the code, into the existing product, or building a completely new product from scratch.
Or maybe if I can extend the question. So it's like, do you have some, I don't know, super fancy plugins for your VS Code, or you are using a specific website that is just hosting the environment for you, where you can just, it's like inject your prompts and stuff like this just to test out,
So again, I'm the type of person that tries to use the latest. I wouldn't say the greatest, but definitely the latest. And so I'm personally using Cursor as my editor, which kind of has like AI built into natively. And so, but coming to your question, I would normally use I typically start with either the developer playground for OpenAI, where they have all the parameters that you would send with a normal API call anyway, and just kind of like get started that way. Or sometimes I would use Vercel's AI. That was a screenshot I actually had in the presentation, where you can test two different models side by side with the same prompt, because you will very quickly get an understanding of what is the level of IQ in the very specific use case that you're in. And so it could very well be, I would say, like, if you're asking generic questions like, hey, summarize an email, every LLM will kind of give you a similar answer, right? Like, I don't think it's going to be that different. If you go into a very domain-specific use case of like, hey, teach me medicine in Latin, it could very well be that some LLMs that have just some specific training set, they will do a better job. And so it's slightly also a gut feeling of like, hey, are you working in a domain, like generic domain, or are you working in a super domain specific domain? If you're working in a very specific domain, I would experiment more across LLMs. Yeah. I will take a few of the questions. Exactly. Yeah, one question from Vasily was, how do you ensure accuracy for translation? Oh, okay. For the latest product, basically the speech to speech. So a great question. The use cases that I'm building the initial application for are not mission critical, and so I'm not building a doctor's office tool. I'm initially focusing on use cases where it doesn't need to be 100% accurate. And so the very first use cases that I'm going into are actually operational tasks where you do not care about building a connection with the other person. You only care about basically getting data or sending data to the other person. So for example, imagine calling Highspool, and you want to ask them, when they're open. Then you don't really care whether the translation is like 90% or 95%. you kind of just want a very specific part of like information, or whether, for example, like a operational heavy company like a freight shipping company, if they want to call the port of Hamburg, of asking them, hey, did the ship leave the harbor, for example? Again, you don't really care whether the nuance is 100% correct or not. And so this is also why I would always, suggest picking initial use cases where you don't need to be 100%.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify that, like on the Commonbase, you say that you empower salespeople, sales teams.
Yeah.
And if I have a sales team and they pitch it to the customer, and then there's this LLM in between hallucinates and says, I don't know, instead of, I don't know, my product costs 200,000 per month or something subscription. That's a big deal. Like, I mean, it's an impact on business if something goes wrong during the sales pitch.
Excellent question. So even though we have the sales use case on our landing page, we are not heavily pushing for that for the very first customers, because we still need to do quite a bit of research in keeping someone's voice and intonation when doing a translation. That is very much a research problem. That is not a commoditized, something that you can take off the shelf. And so even though we want to go space, once we are more confident about our models, so we see that as a market opportunity, that is not something that we're doing right now. One, because the problem that you said, you don't want to lie to a potential customer, not say lie, but let's say mislead them. Second problem, you're actually building a relationship when you're on a sales call. And so you want to sound exactly like you would sound, speaking another language. And so there you want to be as close to real you as possible. And we just know that the tech is not quite there yet. So that's also why we're not focusing on sales as our very first use case. Yeah, but a great question. So let me go down. Okay, you asked about hosting OpenAI's models. So when I was building the very first
one addition. I remember your LinkedIn post, right? Where you, like in the beginning, where ChatGPT was becoming famous and known, you were able like to reduce the response time by 50% or something like that. It was really interesting. Maybe this can be also included into the question.
100%. So what I built as kind of the very first version is I built a routing layer on top of all Azure regions to provide OpenAI's models to people across the world in the lowest latency way. Because the problem with the initial versions of OpenAI's API was that the call always went to West Coast, and so the latency was actually quite large, especially for very small, mission critical applications. And so we built heavily on top of OpenAI, on top of Azure, just by using their APIs, to provide a lower latency service for our customers. When it comes to Azure itself, Azure is still it's not a great user experience. If you compare Azure to Google Cloud or AWS, I would say it is worse, and the bar is very low, right? And so that's also the reason why a lot of people don't want to use Azure, because it's just producing so much more DevOps cost to their teams. A lot of people were using the very first version of my product in order to use OpenAI in Europe-hosted models without needing to adopt Azure and training DevOps people to introduce Azure into their org. And so do it only if kind of the cost is worth it. But I would say as long as you're only using OpenAI's models in Azure, the DevOps cost is rather minimal. And so I think it's worth paying the cost in case you absolutely cannot use OpenAI directly because of legal reasons. Let's see. Oscar, you asked about production grade. Yes, absolutely. So that's what I meant by LLMs being kind of the wild, wild west. So the question is, how can you have mission critical applications reliant on third-party APIs available at all times? And I also took it out of the presentation, actually. But what I love doing once my projects start getting a little bit more mature is building them on top of model agnostic frameworks such as Vercel's AI package for JavaScript or Light LLM for Python, which means that it takes me one line of code to change the LLM running in the background. And typically, also, something that I built in-house, but you can either outsource it or build it in-house, is adding multiple LLMs into the pipeline. So if you do not get a response, if you do not get the first token from your first LLM within the first 300 milliseconds, the query goes to the second LLM. So the worst case scenario is that the user will have a slightly worse user experience, but they will have a user experience. And so, very true, OpenAI is not that reliable. Microsoft Azure is much more reliable, by the way. That was another big benefit. But yes, so having backup LLMs in your cold chain is super useful. I would start introducing that once you start getting into mission critical features that you are also pushing out. We're kind of running out of time. We probably have a hard stop, Chaya. How does it work?
Yes, we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Jacob, and thank you so much, Heiki, for doing this. And yeah, we also have the Slack channel, so ask questions. I mean, everyone can see the responses. That'd be awesome. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your time, guys.
Good
Have
job.
a great one.